Hi, I'm Bill Patton with 720 Degree Coaching, and it's my honor today to have Tom Newkirk on the show, and he's a civil rights attorney who represents coaches who have been poorly treated, fired for the wrong reasons, and we're going to get into advocacy. Athlete-centered coaches really need to advocate for one another and to help make the coaching community start to reflect what the athletes that we're serving. So, Tom, how are you doing?
I'm good, Bill.
Excellent. So, tell us a little bit about you and your background as a civil rights attorney, and how did you kind of get into representing coaches?
Well, I've been a civil rights attorney for about 30 years now here in Iowa, and I started to develop some ideas on what I call, what people have heard the term implicit bias. I've started to develop some ideas a long time ago, about 15, 20 years ago now, on issues of race, and got into that, and then began to realize that gender has a similar problem, but also in athletics in particular, implicit gender bias and stereotyping just kind of has a heavier burden on women in athletics than the general employment population. And so about 10 years ago, represented my first female coach. Her name was Ruth Crow of Iowa State. And we represented her and won a case for her in retaliation because she'd raised an issue Title IX. But I noticed in that trial that there were some issues with student athletes making complaints about her that didn't make any sense given who she was. And so I started looking into that issue and realized that, the student athlete complaint issue was a problem. It was becoming a problem for female coaches particularly, but I also knew that someday it would probably start to impact male coaches as well, but for other reasons. And so it seemed to me that trying to address this problem was important for both people who were my clients, but also for sport generally, because I do believe in shall we say, the power of athletics to transform a young human being into an exceptional person. I do believe in that, not because I was a D1 athlete, just because I've seen it happen with these kids. And so that's kind of that's the whirlwind tour of how I got to where we are now.
Why don't you give us kind of a vague generality of what's the most common type of case? How does it start? How does that process of a coach getting in trouble for the wrong reasons happen?
Well, I focus on student athlete complaints. That's the primary systemic problem that exists in college athletics today and affecting women. I mean, can women be harassed? Sure. Can men be fired for complaining about Title IX just like women? Sure, absolutely. You can have retaliation cases for regardless of gender. But student athletes are the main problem. And what happens is that, a student athlete will normally make a complaint, or a parent often will make a complaint about the coach being mean or a bully or something about their coaching style that then the university then takes and goes completely off the rails with it. They'll do some investigation or they'll the coach. And so that is the most common problem. And I would say that problem is so common now that, we've had 20 female coaches call us in the last 6 months with the same exact problem, which is student athlete complained about me. I got investigated, I got undermined, I got fired, I got forced to resign, and my career is effectively over. And, I've been hearing rumors out there that it's starting to float into the male coaching side a little bit, but it's, again, primarily a female issue that I've seen. So that's the most common problem facing today.
It for sure has. And I faced this, and I actually faced this a couple of weeks ago. I sat in a meeting with my athletic director as I was dealing with a very narcissistic player, and his lawyer mother called me a bully in the meeting. Mm-hmm. And so I stood up and was ready to walk out and say, no, I'm not going to stand for this. And,
right.
And then my athletic director then ordered me to sit back down, and he blasted her. So,
right.
So yeah, I mean, it is really interesting. And I know that there's this undercurrent of social media, conspiracy that happens with players. They'll all, get together and have their little, it's like they're preparing to drive out Frankenstein's monster or something?
Well, it's, one of the, I would say it's like the experience you just mentioned, Bill, is like, yes, you can still be labeled in that way, but what happens is your experience in that labeling is actually different than what a female would go through.
Sure.
You're able to push back and walk out. Very few females would dare do that. That's just a good example of just a slight difference where you have a similar experience, but your ability to push back is different. And the AD had your back. Doesn't quite happen the same for women in the same way for crazy reasons.
So yeah, I do understand that. I mean, it's been known for quite some time that in general, men, just because they're larger and have louder voices and are more physically intimidating, have more authority. But I've seen incredible women coaches and teachers who learn to have more of a command presence and have that rock solid belief in themselves that they have the wherewithal to stand up and walk out. But it is I don't want to argue about social constructs and nature versus nurture, but it is what it is, and we have to be able to work with it, right? So why do coaches need to advocate for themselves? Like, so the female coach, why should she and how can she advocate for herself early in the process when things are going wrong?
Well, I would first of all say to all coaches, you need to advocate for yourselves individually before the things go wrong. In other words, you need to advocate for education of the administration on these issues that I'm talking about today, and also advocate for education of the student athletes and parents before it becomes a problem. And for women, it's even more important to do that because they're more at risk of getting complaints than males for sure, and they're more likely to have complaints that are more aggressive, that they won't let go of it for a female coach. So it's even more important for them to advocate early on about educating and educating the university and the students if they can. Once the thing has gone south or started to go south, it's important to advocate and for oneself. Again, you have to advocate in the right way. Like, I don't believe that a female has the, shall we say, is given the moral authority within the athletic construct to walk out of a meeting like you described. What she can do is she's capable of walking out personally, but within the structure, she's not permitted to do that really. What she can do is advocate for education. She can say, look, guys, I'd like you to take a step back and look at this thing. There's a national issue with student athlete complaints. Let's go get some information. Let's go, like I said, I travel to universities all the time for free and say, I'll just come tell you about it. I'm not going to sue you. I'll just come educate you on it. I could come to your university, Bill, and say, hey, look, I know Bill wasn't in trouble here, but this could get out of hand in some other sport, and you guys want to put a stop to this, so here's some ways to do it. So that's just one way to advocate, and I think there's a difference in terms of, how men and women need to advocate, but I also think that there can be what I call a diversity advocating process. That means that, Bill, you would join together, or a male would join together with a female coach, and you could go together and advocate for changes on this issue together as a diverse team. I think that can be even more powerful.
Yeah, and I think it's sad and interesting that that's necessary. But I'm thinking it could be helpful if that female coach is also really advocating for what she believes in with her team first, where she says, because nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. And so I think winning the battle of hearts and minds individually with each athlete and having that, one-on-one with each athlete where you say, hey, I really care about you as a person more than the athlete. I think, you can kind of inoculate yourself from complaints that way.
I think that in a perfect world, that should be true, Bill. But I would bet you a good deal of money that every single female coach out there is doing exactly what you suggest, or they're trying to. I think that they know they even have to do that more than some male coaches do. But again, it's good advice what you're saying, that you should go out and speak to these students in a personal level and advocate for yourself in that way. I think that's great advice that you're giving generally. So I want to separate out the idea that you're giving this good advice, and not every young coach, male or female, may know this advice you're giving, and they should go do that. I can say it's important, but it's also important to understand that even if a female does everything you're suggesting, she can still be judged slightly differently. That's the
Okay. So
nature
let's take it up a notch. So let's take it up a notch then. So, I mean, I think that that's really baseline, really. I mean, that ought to be universal. But I don't think
I agree.
But I don't think it always is. I think that there are women coaches who go at it differently, and then they suffer because they didn't do that. They're trying to do something else. Maybe they're trying to act more tough or something like that. Okay. But I think another thing maybe would be to send the message immediately, hey, I'm not your mother. I'm your coach. I'm not your mother. So, don't compare me unfavorably to your mother. I would like to be judged. If you want to judge me, I really want you to evaluate me on my coaching skills and compare me to any other coach at the school.
Hmm.
So, or any other coach that you've known. But because I think this was my question when you spoke at the Women's Tennis Coaches Association thing. Do you think it has something to do with unfair comparisons to mothers and fathers?
It does. I mean, that's the simplest way to consider what I have to say is simply this. Mom's the nurturing person, and oh, honey, are you okay? Dad's a disciplinarian. That's how we structurally socialize our kids. And when they go into coaching, they expect the same thing from female coach versus male coach. That's really the simplest way that explains the bias that I'm talking about. I will tell you that, I mean, Bill, after talking to many, many female coaches, one thing that has been consistent is they all tell me, I go to these student athletes, I do advocate, I'm with them, I'm telling them that I care about them, I'm telling their parents I care about them. They just don't hear it. And I think the thing that sometimes the male coach can miss is that female coaches have to live in a different world. They really do. They do have to advocate and nurture differently and more strongly. And they understand they have to do that. Maybe younger coaches haven't learned that yet, but any female coach that's been in the business 10 years has already learned that they have to advocate and go to these students and try and nurture them in the best way they can. I think that you raise an important question, though, which is, how should they go speak to their students differently? Can they go to a student and say, hey, I'm not your mom, I'm your coach? I think coaches have actually told me they've said those exact words, but can they do that? How do we educate student athletes on this issue so we're not raising a red flag that doesn't exist? Like, for example, should a woman go and say, hey, look, I'm at risk of gender stereotypes, don't do that to me? I'm not certain she can do that.
Right. Yeah, you're calling for it. Yeah.
Some need to talk about it. I think personally, again, I'm a big believer in diverse presentations and decision making. What I mean by that, Bill, is I think that if all the coaches, male and female, got together and together as a team went to these students today and said, look, we are not your moms and dads. We are your coaches. It's a very specific profession, very specific thing that we do. Do not judge us differently as a group. I think that would be an effective way of doing it that wouldn't single out women or isolate men either way. Just an interesting idea.
Okay. And then what are some other ways that, because so you already mentioned that, if a male coach sort of went with the female coach to the meeting where something was being discussed, solving a particular problem.
Yeah.
What are some other ways that male coaches or a group of coaches together can advocate for one another and support each other?
I think that the student athlete complaint issue, one of my arguments to universities today, and to men coaches too, is to say, look, aren't student athlete complaints a headache? They're literally a headache now, where you've got helicopter parents, bulldozer parents, lawnmower parents, whatever you want to call them, and these students who are not, who are just have these odd expectations that are undermining the value of coaching generally. I think that men and women can gather together and agree on that and say, let's figure out where the lines are between the I'm your best friend coach and I'm really abusive coach. Let's clearly establish standards where we fit within those lines. And then we go advocate for ourselves together to the administration to say, these are our standards. We live within those standards. We will be supported if we live within those standards, male or female. Okay. And I think you can advocate together for educating students on this issue, for getting buy-in from the students and parents, maybe making them a sign of before the year comes up, they sign a statement saying, you will have failed expectations. You may be upset. You may be angry at my coaching decisions. you've bought into a system where you're going to agree to this process. I mean, that just is and again, I have some ideas on it, Bill, but I got to tell you, I think it's male and female coaches who need to get together and decide what's the best way to approach this as a team, as opposed to, just these isolated, is softball going to do it, or is tennis going to do it, or is football going to do it?
Right. Well, okay. So, I know a good friend of mine was a 7-time national championship coach, and at one institution, he recruited 3 different young women that played on his women's team. And all 3 of them presented themselves as being, real team players and whatnot. And then as soon as they started with his team, he found out that all 3 of them were big trouble. And essentially, they orchestrated his ouster.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So now from that, I'm gonna throw at you something that we haven't really talked about, but it just popped in. So now we've had the big revelation that something we always knew was happening is that elite people are bribing university coaches and officials to get their children in, presumably as athletes, but maybe not, onto teams to gain admission to these prestigious universities. Mm-hmm. So now, to what extent, maybe that issue isn't the same, but it's similar in that we kind of have this this entitled, my dad paid for the science building, kind of a thing. So to what extent does that entitlement of some students play into this particular problem?
I don't know if it does or not. I'd say that it seems like those would be outliers, people that make more money than probably you or I do. I think, it's just a different level of, elitism, shall we say. The only way it would be connected would be as if you found that most of the teams they're putting the kids on are women's teams. Because, for example, and this is really going deep into the rabbit hole, Bill, so forgive me.
Okay.
But one of the things in college athletics is that sometimes athletic directors do view the female team as a throwaway. And I've seen them put female athletes in different, like they'll take a female rower and put her on the women's tennis team because she needs to keep her scholarship, but they just don't view them as being sufficiently different to not do that. You just say, what do you put a rower on my team for? That makes no sense. But they do that for women's teams. They don't really do that for men's teams in the same way. Now, maybe I'm wrong. And maybe the elitism is you're putting men on the football team or the basketball team just as a throwaway, like you are the women's lacrosse team, a swimming team. That could be. But I would bet you that it's leaning more that they're using the women's sports as the way in than men's sports. So that's how the gender issue plays into it. But again, that's way down the rabbit hole of a structural problem and maybe beyond what we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay. So let's back up out of that hole for a second. Yeah. So, okay. Now, when we're talking about building community among coaches, athletes, parents, what are some of the best practices to inoculate ourselves against those problems? How do we build that community?
I think that's one thing you just came up with, which is to call it building a community. I think that's a great framing of what you should be doing, which is that this is a community. And I think you need to, again, I believe in diversity. I believe diversity is not just a politically correct word. Males and females should together decide how this should look. Not an all-male thing, not a bunch of women thinking that, well, let's figure out how we can do it that the men will accept, or vice versa. It's a diverse process where you have 3 female coaches and 3 male coaches, and you go think about, in the university, how should we build the community? How should we educate the students, the parents, the administration as a group to allow us to coach in the way we want to coach, to be successful, and to ensure that we reduce these complaints from student athletes and these complaints of helicopter parents. And exactly what that should look like, I'm not exactly sure, because to be honest with you, most people don't touch it with a 10-foot pole. I mean, they talk to the students at the beginning of the season, and they might talk to the parents sometimes, but pretty much you're not bringing them in and educating people as a communal group. And I think that, if you approach it as a community, like you said, I think the sky's the limit. And what that exactly looks like is something you got to sit down and figure out, and so I don't know that there are any best practices, Bill. I think that we can come up with the best practices if we put our heads together with a group of female and male coaches and decided what that could look like.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And now, I mean, it's okay. I'm coaching high school. I know you conferred upon me a university job, but I appreciate that. But no, it's really interesting to me. So here's an example. I have parents who come to the high school tennis matches, and one thing that confuses the kids and the parents is my particular rules for court etiquette for cheering for a tennis match, which is different than anything else.
Right.
So the way I present that to them is really important, because I know that if I'm punitive and mean about it, then I have an opportunity to really turn people off. But what I try to do is very calmly say, all right, if this happens, do this. And if this happens, do that. And, and then we're not offending the other team. And then we're also supporting our team within the, blah, blah, blah. And so,
Right.
and that takes all of 90 seconds. So, sometimes we can inoculate ourselves against complaints by just taking that 90 seconds to communicate properly and in the right spirit, right? So, okay, now, when is it time to initiate professional legal help? And I'm guessing that people don't do it soon enough.
Well, I want to be clear that, my approach to this is completely different, I believe, than other law firms in the United States. And how do I know that? Because I'm part of a legal blog where there's 2,000 other employment lawyers doing what I do, and I know that our firm's approach is different. So we approach it with two different hats. You're talking about legal help, which means I put my lawyer hat on, my civil rights lawyer hat on. I go advocate for someone because they're about to be disciplined or fired, or I'm going to sue the university. That's one aspect of it. The other hat that I wear is that of an educator, where I come in and I educate the university, or I meet with a group of coaches and talk to them about how to reduce gender bias in the workplace, or how to advocate for themselves in a way that is not going to result in resentment and retaliation in the university. I completely take my lawyer hat off, even though I'm aware of the law, et cetera, but I don't. I go in as an educator. So on the education side, there's never too early to reach out to me on that front. I don't, charge a whole bunch of money to do that. I often don't charge anything to do that, because I believe that I change the world much more effectively as an educator than as an advocate, as a lawyer, as a lawyer. And so that's one thing. So I want to be clear that people can say, just calling me up or emailing me for help or some advice or for coming up with some community ideas, Bill, like you suggested, I do that any day of the week. The second thing is, when you reach out for legal help is, when you begin to see some student athlete complaint issues, particularly if you're female, maybe to a lesser extent if you're a person of color, regardless of your gender, you could look into that as well. I think that, if you're a male and you have some pretty aggressive kids and you have a very elitist sport or elitist school, like an Ivy League school, I don't know what high school you're teaching, but it could be, you have a very moneyed school. That could be something where the parents have very high expectations and very high expectations of everyone. That means that a man could be a little higher risk there than normal. But pretty much as a male, you want to get legal help when you really feel you're in trouble. Women need to get legal help much sooner. I would say, like, the minute a complaint starts to hit them of any kind, they should reach out. And always, everyone should reach out sooner in terms of getting the education going.
Yeah. Well, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, I have been told my dad can get you fired.
I'm sure that's true.
I was teaching at a school where I was accused of hazing, and it was it was this crazy straw man situation where the school had such a horrible hazing issue that, because I had done something that could maybe be construed that way,
right,
and I became their easy straw man to knock over. And when I met with the principal, she told me, well, we've taken down Division I coaches before in college. And I'm like, oh, interesting. But it's good. It's interesting. I mean, it opened my eyes to the dark side of this, and how there are people who have agendas and they want another notch on their gun or belt.
Right.
So when you're up against that, what do you do? So any tips for dealing with the dark side? These people who just, I don't know, they get ego satisfaction over taking a coach down.
I think that, first of all, I wouldn't necessarily interpret that as being that their sole goal is to take a coach down. Sometimes what you're hearing is bluff and bluster, where people are there for other emotional reasons, like they feel their kid's being undermined, they want their kid to do well, and their kid's failing their expectations. Their kid's probably telling them things about you and other coaches that aren't exactly true. And so they're there, because they've been given some level of misinformation. Plus, you wouldn't expect them to take off their parent hat. So you got to understand that thing. It's not necessarily, but then they get into a meeting and they want to prove that they've got power. That's a different problem. What I would say though is that, the way to deal with it is to again, try and avoid it in the first place. You've got to get whoever your administration is to educate students and parents earlier on about, do you respect what coaching is? And do you respect what athletics is? Nobody's being a Bobby Knight anymore. Most men are not being Bobby Knights. Maybe there's a few out there, and maybe they're pushing kids a little harder than they should sometimes in strength and conditioning. That could be. But, nobody's walking up and spitting and screaming and, punching a kid and pushing him to the ground. That's rare because you know how it is in coaching. You can't get away with that stuff, even if you wanted to anymore.
Right.
And so you have confidence in that. And you got to educate the parents that there's just a difference of what does coaching mean? How is it valued? And do you value it? Build that respect in parents.
Let's talk about Bobby Knight for a second, because I'm serious, because I part of Bobby Knight's problem, I do believe, this is just my opinion. I mean, so people can hate me as much as they want over this. Okay, I believe that these Bobby Knight incidents, and there were multiple incidents. I mean, how many were there in reality over that period of time, right? I don't think a lot, but he played up that persona. Mm-hmm. He played that up to the media. He reveled in that. And I think that was part of his undoing. But Bobby Knight has the record for the highest graduation rate for a Division I college basketball team. Mm-hmm. So what's abuse? What is abuse? Is it abuse when you're really tough on your players on a daily basis and they graduate and go on to incredible success later? Mm-hmm. Or is it abuse to dangle a D1 scholarship with the hopes of going pro and having a graduation rate at 20%? What's the real abuse? So I'm not here to defend Bobby Knight and his incidents.
Right.
But I think when we look at what is the goal of being a student athlete, well, it would be to get a fine education, I would hope, to some extent. So anyway, I think if we can balance those out with what's the overall effect, I think that's an important thing to do. But yeah, I mean, I don't condone for a moment any of the abusive behavior that Knight has exhibited.
Here's the thing. Let me back up a second. Okay. I only use Bobby's Knight because it's a contextual argument I use, because most people know who he was, and they, for good or bad reasons, may define him as someone who was, in the old days, close to the line in the old days. He's this vision of a coaching that used to be the way it was acceptable, maybe it's not acceptable. That's the only reason I use that. I have no idea whether the guy is actually abusive or not, nor do I care. Well, I look at it like this. I don't care how coaches, from my perspective as a civil rights lawyer, I don't care how coaches coach. Truly. It's like, you guys decide where the line is, what's successful. Now, everyone else cares, but I don't care. I just want to know that if men decide here in the middle of this line, here's where between coaching is, that women can be in there just like men. Now, yes. If Bobby Knight is the coaching icon, women should be able to coach that way. And that's my point. Now, I do think a second point you've made, which is a good one, which is coaches don't want to develop standards. That's one of the dirty secrets here. The answer is, let's have a discussion about what was effective about Bobby Knight's approach. Let's have a discussion about why the best friend coach is not a good coach. He's not a good coach. But let's also discuss why people who think their vision of Bobby Knight may not be good either, because they're trying to be harsher than they should be, whoever that is. So coming up with standards.
Yeah, this is good. I gotcha. And now, I mean, was not Pat Summitt the Bobby Knight of women's basketball?
I sincerely doubt that. I think that she had a reputation for being firm and direct, which she probably
No,
was, but
I've
I'll bet
seen
you
her
anything that
mic'd
that's
up.
something you could not get away. Yeah.
I've seen her mic'd up, and she was really tough, and and she could give acerbic criticism, and all that. But anyway, so let's just put a little bow on that one and put it away now. But but I think it is good to talk for a moment about that old school coaching style, which is still around some. It's still out there, and people are transitioning, I think, to a kinder, gentler approach, because it works better. What else do people need to know in order to advocate and build? And
the problem with the student athlete complaint issue generally and the gender bias issue is it's such a systemic, overwhelming problem that I try and focus on things that we can fix in the real world, like before we all turn 85 years old. And therefore, I keep going back to this and saying, I think it's education of yourself and awareness. It's education of the administration, whatever level you're at, and then coming up with a plan to educate students and parents on this issue to gain more respect for the coaching generally and to reduce the risk of complaints that are petty based on coaching behaviors or using labels. I think that can change the world for female coaches if you do that, and also help protect men, by the way. It'll help protect men who are doing good coaching. And I think that that's the number one thing I would tell individuals. And so, and also it's like, you've got to have people come in and educate on how implicit bias works. I believe that's important because, it's when you see a female student label a female as abusive, it is going to be 99% of the time she's labeling her because of her gender in some way. A male can be labeled as abusive, but it's not going to be because of his gender. It may be because they're entitled or crazy or whatever it is, but they're not going to be labeled because they're men. That's the one thing I can guarantee you is true. So I think that education is important. And I do believe that your idea of a communal approach to coaching is a good one. It's an excellent one. And I think that coaches should get together and start to carry that idea forward in a positive way.
One thing that's been going through my mind is I think that part of us who were part of the Star Trek generation, where we saw the Starship Enterprise with this diverse group of people who somehow were former enemies, and they all came together to be friends and operate the starship and explore the universe. I mean, I think if we kind of get into a Gene Roddenberry vision, utopian vision of the future, we can start to make that happen. But
I don't think you can go quite that far, Bill. I think you can just say, look, there are males and females and whites and African Americans and other persons of color. If you get a diverse group together to decide how coaching should look for the next 20 years, and take the good and the bad, get the wheat and the chaff, set up standards, I think you can carry it forward, and you guys can be in control of what that looks like, as opposed to letting the tail wag the dog, which is what's happening right now with the negative students and versus the negative parents who are controlling this process. And you need to do it, and I think you can do it as a group if you realize why you need to do it, why you need to take steps together.
Okay, so let's wrap it up here. What are the takeaways? Okay, so if we're speaking right now to the coach that's seeing the first signs of trouble, what's through that process where it's ramping up and they're being called into meetings, to be castigated, publicly and whatnot. What are 2 or 3 things that people need to know practically to do to mitigate that?
Well, the first thing I would do is tell them to say, look, I've heard about the student athlete complaint problem. It seems like it's a systemic problem across the United States. I hope that you as the administration will educate yourself on this issue before you take any drastic steps. That's number one. Number two is, I would say, and my advice can be similar for males and females, but it's more important for females, to say, well, I'd like you, before you start, this investigation, to think about it like, are these complaints actually substantive? What have the students actually said? Don't let them use labels. Have they been asked to write down exactly what I did as a coach, how I yelled at them, what I said to them, as opposed to, I'm just using the label of abuse or bully? Like even in your situation, Bill, like if you'd ask them to define exactly what you did rather than use a label, it might have dispelled the problem. Ask them to educate as to whether or not there's a gender difference in how students complain, because that even a male coach who's coaching women can say, hey, are men and women complaining differently? That's not appropriate. So those are just a couple of ideas.
So what happens when they can't or won't define the actual behavior? Because I actually did that. I'm like, can you tell me what this looks like? You know, okay, I heard this complaint, but what was the behavior? What was the setting? Because I have no idea what you're talking about. So, I mean, I really need to be enlightened on this. I mean, I can learn and change, but I need to know specifics before I can do it.
I think that's the appropriate thing to do, Bill, is what you just said. You're right, though. Administration may not respond appropriately because they haven't thought it through. But by asking the question, you're starting to set yourself up for a little bit of a defense here. That's why you have to ask the question, even if the answer is we don't know or we're not going to tell you. And often the reason they're not going to tell you, Bill, is because they're a little bit embarrassed that they didn't ask the question to start with. That's part of the problem. So the last thing I would say is, you know, I would not hesitate to have people reach out to me, because I'm just telling you, I do not know how to.
But thanks so much for your time. I found this fascinating, and you know, I learned a lot from your talk in Indian Wells, and I was impressed, and I was like, wow. I mean, now I realize that I need to be in this game, you know, playing with my
fellow. And an important component of reducing gender bias, Bill. Don't let them forget that they can really help too. They can really advocate for women and also advocate for themselves in the same way.
All right, very good. I'm glad you made a nice comeback at the end. That's awesome.
Okay, thanks, Bill.
Thank you so much.